Hi guys, Gavin here from ABR Americas, and welcome to the 5th episode of our ABR live chats, where tonight we're going to be talking about scoliosis. A deep topic, certainly. So we're going to cover a few main areas. One, what is scoliosis? Two, why is it so prevalent within the context of neurological and neurodevelopmental disorders? And a little bit about how we in ABR approach scoliosis and how we address it. The first, I think, big message or comment to make is that a scoliosis is complex. There's nothing simple about it. There's a very high level of complexity there. So the fact that it's complex also means by default that there's a certain unpredictability about it. So although this unpredictability is very real, there are some fundamentals and aspects about it that are relatively reliable. And that being said, these reliable aspects, and in some ways there's some predictability within the unpredictability, this reliability actually presents some good and unique opportunities for us to slip through, for lack of a better word, and establish a certain course of action with respect to scoliosis. So the big question, or the big general question to lead off is, what is scoliosis? So if you were to look it up, I guess Google it, it oddly enough has a very narrow definition. And that definition generally comes in the form of scoliosis is, quote unquote, an abnormal lateral curvature of the spine. So, although that statement is indeed true, there's nothing false about it, it's actually a little bit too simplistic. Again, scoliosis is a complex issue. So, yes, the abnormal lateral curvature of the spine is present, but the one thing to understand certainly is that there's a very significant rotational component to scoliosis as well. So that is the other dimension that, oddly enough, gets a little bit lost, especially when we talk about the definition. So the lateral abnormalities, lateral meaning left to right, these are profound, but also we have to also understand that it's not just a lateral curvature, but there's a heavy rotational, a profound rotational component in there as well. And by rotational, what I mean is that the vertebrae themselves, each of them, depending on where the curve is and where the rotation is, each of these vertebrae express or manifest a certain lateral rotation to it. And both of these elements, the lateralization or the curve itself and the rotation, are profound. And in every person, it's unique where the curves are, where the rotations are. And again, they're profound. However, both manifest in different extremes depending on the individual. It's all different. And the interesting thing about the lateralization and the rotation as well is that both of them play on each other. And what I mean by that, it's a reciprocal relationship. So the more curve you have, the more rotation you have. And in effect, the rotation actually is what precipitates or exacerbates the curve. But that works the other way around as well. The more rotation you have, the obviously you have the more tendency to lateralize or to exacerbate or exaggerate the curve. So now we get to another important point, which is scoliosis isn't unique to cerebral palsy. It's not unique to neurological or neurodevelopmental disorders. Scoliosis is actually something that is found within the healthy population. Okay, and by healthy I mean that there's no underlying pathology there. So in the healthy population, you have people who manifest scoliosis in various degrees and various extremes as well. But the fact also remains is that scoliosis is extremely prevalent within the context of brain injury, within the context of neurological disorders and neurodevelopmental disorders. So we get to another big question, which is, why is this? Why is scoliosis and other things such a prevalent manifestation within the context of neurodevelopmental disorders? So the specific answer to why scoliosis is prevalent, or maybe why it exists in an individual person or individual persons, that answer is unique to the specific individual. Why is there scoliosis in person A and person B and person C is unique to each and every person. But within that, the thing to remember, or the thing to take away from all of that, is the fact that neurodevelopmental disorders, they formally manifest in what's called profound challenges in movement and posture. So within the biomechanical context, posture certainly and movement is profoundly affected. So the question becomes, in what way? And it's generally derived or sourced in this way. These challenges of movement and posture, they are manifest as multiple profound deficits in the ability or the capability to counteract or interact or manage the effects of gravity. Therefore, there's essentially, when we talk about managing and navigating the forces of gravity, there's a formal what's called a postural weakness. Postural weakness means weakness in the passive postural ability. And this weakness, in fact, is actually found or derived or has its genesis in the deep core of the body. Following that, the thing to remember, and I think the following statements are actually the linchpin through which everything actually hangs with respect to scoliosis. And it's the following. The spine is essentially the primary mechanism that drives movement, human movement. And in many texts, the spine is actually defined as an engine, a quote unquote as an engine, which is kind of works counter to the current intuition, which is that the spine is formally like a rigid structure, a rod, for all intents and purposes, that the body counts on for specific postural support. So this is intuitive. This is an intuitive thought, and there is some truth to that. The spine indeed does provide some architectural support for the body, but again, the spine's main role, the thing it was designed to do, is to drive human movement. And the spine, formally and architecturally, is completely inadequate, being a sort of straight, longitudinal, relatively dense and rigid structure. It's entirely inadequate at providing pure postural, or to manage full postural loads as well as drive movement. So we have the final not flow, but the final cascade here. So this sort of 4 levels of cascade essentially is the generic or the very sort of basic cascade at which the scoliotic condition proceeds. So again, and to repeat, neurological disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders, they manifest this profound, deep core postural weakness. So this postural weakness, the inability to respond adequately under loads or under the effects of gravity, that increases the stresses, the biomechanical stresses, especially in the axial or the vertical way, imposed onto the spine. So increased spinal stresses, and these stresses are actually compounded for a long period of time. So prolonged stresses. And at the same time, we have to add that these stresses are imposed as this organism, as the body, as the child, as the person is growing, is getting taller, is getting longer, getting wider, and getting heavier. So we have the profound deep core postural weakness increases the stresses applied to the spine or vertebral column. These stresses are imposed for prolonged periods of time, and therefore over time it manifests, whether it's in a gradual sense or in an abrupt way, manifests in profound distortion and dysfunction of the spine. Now the big money question, or big money questions, plural, is the following. Can we prevent scoliosis? And along those lines, can we reverse it? So can we prevent, can we reverse? So there is no monolithic answer to this question. There is no yes or no. As with any system or systems that are complex, that's by definition complexity. Again, as I mentioned right off at the beginning of the chat, complexity implies in an explicit way that there's some unpredictability there. However, there is a plethora of precedent, of reliable precedent, that suggests that, again, within this unpredictability, and going back to this cascade I was speaking about before, profound deep core postural weakness, increased spinal stresses applied over long periods of time, and the resulting spinal distortion and deformation. There's significant amount of precedence that the scoliotic condition it is possible, yes, that this condition can be prevented, can be limited, and perhaps more surprisingly can be reversed. So all of those 3 things apply. However, this applies to those strategies that have a focused plan, a focused strategy that deals with the root cause of the spinal deformity and dysfunction itself, which is, again, this deep core. So we're not speaking about the muscles or the core as in the traditional, maybe intuitive understanding of the abs or the abdominal muscles. If you look at any anatomy textbook, or you're familiar even from a rudimentary level with anatomy, the abdominal muscles, they lie and they extend out into the back, but they are extremely superficial. So when we speak about a deep core postural weakness, we are talking about deeper than the skeletal muscle. We're talking in at the visceral level, and again, viscera, fascia, connective tissue, this permeates all of the abdomen, pelvis, all of the core. So this is what we're speaking of. So when a strategy has focused attention that addresses the deep core postural weaknesses, these strategies actually yield those options and opportunities to prevent scoliosis, to limit the extent of scoliosis, and also, in many cases that we've seen here at ABR, even reverse the scoliotic condition. And one of the more helpful ways, in our opinion, with respect to scoliosis, to look at it, is it's not, again, complexity. It's complex. It's not a simple case of the spine being crooked or the spine being curved and that's it, as if it was something that is completely separate and independent of anything else. It's not a simple case of just the spine being crooked. And scoliosis, to be quite honest, is a manifestation. It's a manifestation or a symptom of a deeper underlying problem. And again, I go back to those original statements where the spine itself, or the scoliosis, the scoliotic condition, is something that's derived from the deep core postural weakness. So the scoliosis itself, or the appearance of scoliosis, is a manifestation, is a symptom. It's symptomatic of something that's problematic. When we get into some of the more conventional options for scoliosis, specifically braces and corsets. To be clear, it's important to mention that whether they're soft braces, whether they are rigid braces, these are viable options within the larger rehabilitative plan and treatment plan. So rigid braces, soft braces, and the other plethora of options, strategies and options, these are all viable. But again, back to the previous statement, which is it's not just a simple case of the spine being crooked. This is why that the fact remains that although the corsets definitely do provide support and some relief, especially when these conditions are severe, of the severe kind. They do provide support, they provide some stability. This is why they don't, in an effective way, and in a let's say, reliable way, resolve the challenges of scoliosis. Is that it's simply unloads a spine that's been excessively loaded in the first place. So again, it does provide relief. If the curve is extreme, then these braces definitely do provide some temporary resolve, but within the context of rehabilitating, preventing, and also reversing, they do have their limitations. Again, we have to identify the intended purpose of the corset or the bracing. If something doesn't address the underlying root problem, which is the deep core postural weakness, then the ability to rehabilitate is limited, if not nil. Now, when we put braces and corsets into the proper context, where relieving pressure, providing some comfort, and definitely providing some support, they fall into the more tactical domain. So again, those two ideas and understandings, the strategic idea of addressing the deep core postural weakness as a strategic plan, and the corsets as something that definitely should fall within the context of a tactical idea, so some temporary immediate relief and things like that. This is the smart and cogent approach. So now we get into the maybe specific way, or that non-specific way, that ABR approaches the challenges, the very deep challenges of scoliosis. So the ABR approach not only to scoliosis actually, but to the larger objective of improvement and rehabilitation, is actually fundamentally uniquely focused. In other words, certainly the first and primary objective, but that isn't just at the beginning, it actually follows through the whole process, uniquely focused on improving the deep core postural weakness. That's the fundamental root of the whole ABR principle, but especially when we get into the context of scoliosis. So again, if we look at that cascade, deep core postural weakness, increased stresses imposed onto the spine, these stresses applied in a prolonged sense or prolonged context in an evolving, growing organism, resulting in the deformation, the lateral curvature, and the rotational characteristics of scoliosis. So if you have something, a protocol, a platform, a strategy that addresses the deep core postural weakness, so this weakness gets less and less. So if we look at it in the reverse way, we are actually building up or building on postural strength. Therefore, what happens? Improving deep core postural strength results in decreased mechanical, biomechanical, gravitational, tensional, rotational stresses applied to the spine. That not only does it relieve the spine in a way, or offload the spine in a way so that it can actually devote time and metabolic resources to movement, which is what it's been designed for, engineered for. It actually provides a window or an opportunity for us as professionals, as the healthcare system, to get in and provide opportunities for the muscles of the vertebral column to release, those that are always active and tense and therefore maybe fibrotic and stiff, to release, but also those on the other side of the calculus or calculation that are very loose and weak and underperforming if they're performing at all. And all of that together, when done in a very gradual and very strategic way, that is what actually, one, can prevent the appearance of scoliosis, two, can limit the extent of scoliosis, in other words, limit the potentiation or exacerbation of the scoliotic condition, but also, as we've seen in many situations, in many cases, documented cases, the scoliotic condition can actually be reversed. So I will leave the conversation with three main takeaways. Of course, there are many. We can dig deeper into scoliosis and have more specific and detailed conversations, but the three main takeaways are the following. Number one, as mentioned before, this deep core postural weakness. Postural improvement, especially when we talk about it in the legitimate way or within the context of the deep core postural strength. Postural improvement takes time. So passive posture, as I'm sitting here, as you may be sitting over there, there is no active musculoskeletal activation here. I'm very relaxed. There's no neurological resources being spent on activating the back, and there's no real muscular component there to this passive posture. This is all something that's derived from the deep viscera, from the fascia, from the connective tissue. So to engage these tissues in the real way and facilitate improvement, these things take time, and of course a lot of work and a lot of focus and a lot of effort. So that's main takeaway number one. Main takeaway number two, which I think we touched on a little bit at the beginning of the chat, is that scoliosis becomes more and more challenging, more and more problematic with increasing height or length and increasing weight. So the longer, the larger, the heavier an individual gets, the more loads are applied onto the spine. Therefore, the distortion becomes potentially worse and worse and worse and worse. So, therefore, from a strategic plan, when we talk about can we prevent, knowing this, that the longer, larger, heavier organism imposes more stress onto the spine and therefore things become more difficult to manage and unwind, then fundamentally, and all neurodevelopmental disorders manifest some level of deep core postural weakness. So from a strategic preventative standpoint, it'd be very prudent, whether you have indications of a specific curve or not, a specific curve or a non-specific curve, it would be prudent to integrate some kind of mechanism, some kind of platform, some kind of strategy that addresses the deep core posture in order to prevent any potential challenges that may or may not appear a little bit later on down the road. And the third takeaway, this is something that I mentioned before, is that the spine is very much so a victim of this deep core postural weakness. It's when I say victim, I oppose it with the term perpetrator. So this nasty curve, problematic, very difficult, inconvenient, uncomfortable curve. It's actually again a manifestation. It's actually symptomatic of a deeper underlying problem. So therefore, fundamentally speaking, and also practically speaking, permanent and lasting improvement when we speak about scoliosis, whether it's about stopping or arresting any further progress or even hopefully, potentially, possibly reversing it, that has to start with addressing not the symptom. The symptom needs to be addressed, certainly, yes, let me correct. The symptom or symptoms definitely need to be addressed, but for the lasting, permanent, long-term solution, there has to be something that addresses the root problem. So I hope that a brief introduction into scoliosis has been productive, helpful, and I encourage everybody to continue the conversation, and I also invite you to communicate with us more, whether it's here on this platform or whether it's through our direct email address, info@abramericas.com, and just ask us, come and find out how these specific postural protocols can work in general, but maybe perhaps more importantly, how they can work for you and work for your child. So again, I invite you to add your comments, your feedback, your concerns even here down below, and let's continue the conversation. And I look forward to reading your comments and reading your questions, and I look forward to seeing you next time.